Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 13. We are going through the 6-layer framework for establishing enterprise architecture practices, and we are at the architecture domains layer. And the last few weeks, we've been spending time on the business architecture. And now from this week onwards, we'll look at the information architecture. Right. So information, so though I am using, though business architecture, information architecture, and application and technology architectures are terminologies I'm reusing from the TOGAF framework. But the way I look at information architecture is slightly different from the way TOGAF defines it, right? So TOGAF defines information architecture as two parts to its data architecture and application architecture, but I would like to split the interface information architecture and application architecture in a slightly different way. In my view, information architecture is a layer or a domain that provides us the ability to abstract the business requirements from the business architecture into a logical components that can be implemented on the IT world, right? So it is an tool or a way to abstract the business requirements is the way I look at the information architecture as. And those abstraction helps us in the agility and the scalability of the architecture. And those components can be taken to the application realized through the application architecture is the way I look at it, right? So let's spend next few weeks on talking about the information architecture. Right. So in this video, we will just take a overall view at the information architecture, and then from the next video, we can go into the specific components. Right. So let's look at what are the key characteristics of information architecture. Right. So information architecture, as I said, it is basically realizes the business architecture through a set of well-defined implementable logical components. When I say implementable, this is not to be tied to any applications or anything in the so that we'll get into when we get into application architecture. These are logical components, right, which are abstractions of the business architecture, right? It basically defines a way to realize the business business architecture components, right? So let's look at some of the key characteristics, right? It addresses the business architecture in its entirety, right? There should not be any gaps between whatever components we have defined in the business architecture. Everything has to be represented in the information architecture. It basically consists of components that can be realized independently. So we are building basically bringing a logical set of components. Those can be implemented independently of each other. And these components should be composable. So once we build these independent components, we should be able to put them together to realize the business architecture or the requirements that came from the business architecture, right? The key aspect of the information architecture is it has to accommodate the extension of the business architecture. That's where the flexibility piece should come in, right? That's how the abstraction would help us, right? So when the business evolves, when there are changes to the business architecture, how can the information architecture absorb that changes without going through massive changes, right? So that's a key aspect of the bringing in the information architecture in the way I am looking at, right? So that abstraction provides that capability. It is independent of the application that will realize the information architecture. So that's a key thing. So we are not talking about applications now, right? We are just abstracting the business requirements into a set of logical components. And later we'll look at how in the application architecture, how we will be realizing those components, right? It captures the structural and behavior requirements from the business architecture components. So that's where it differs from TOGAF, where TOGAF, the data architecture, it's only looking at the structural aspects. When I talk about information architecture, I'm looking at both structural and behavioral aspects, right? So let's look at what are the components of information architecture, right? So these are the four, in my view, these are the four components that needs to be on the information architecture side. So the IT capabilities one. So we looked at in one of the previous videos how we are can abstract business capabilities into IT capabilities. So IT capability is an abstraction of all the business capabilities we have defined in the business architecture, right? So some of them we could reuse the business capabilities as is, right? But some of them could be abstracted into a higher level capability that IT needs to implement, right? So this is the IT capability as a component allows us to bring in that reusability of the capabilities and bring in the capabilities that the IT needs to implement at a higher level of abstraction than directly implementing the business capabilities. Business objects are I would say more related to the business entities. We looked at so business entities are just structural elements. So that directly maps to business objects, but business objects are beyond that, right? We have to identify the behaviors that go along with the business entities. So whatever business functions we have identified, or the IT capabilities we have identified. So whatever is related to that business business entity, we should be able to align it and create a business objects out of it, right? So it is a mix of the structural elements from the business entities and the behavioral capabilities that come from business functions or business capabilities, etc. Right? So which can be related to that. So it's basically it takes care of business objects, takes care of the structure and obviously the CRUD functions of that structure. And then it takes care of any validations that are related to that object. So any relationship that needs to be managed, etc. Right? Whatever it more aligns to an object-oriented concepts of the object, but I would like to keep it little abstract, not tied to specific object-oriented principles. Right? So it's just a combination of the structural elements and the behavioral elements. Right? Some of the objects could be very focused on the behavioral. Some of them could be very structural. But we'll keep it very flexible so it can be a mix of both, right? The next key component is the services. So this is how we deliver the business capabilities, right? So whatever business capabilities or business functions we have defined, how are we going to create that deliverable services, right, to the business or the customers whoever it is targeted to, right? So we will look at it. How do we map it, right? So in the typical, I'm considering services as two types of services. One, I'm calling it experience services. This is how we deliver the services to the customers or the employees within the company, right? These could be like, when I say experience services, this could be what we expose the service as on an web, as a web application or a mobile app or on an IVR or through a voice, like a voice-enabled tool like Alexa, or it could be a conversational tool like chat, like a live chat or a chatbot, etc. So it could be any engagement tool. It is where the services is offered to the customer, right? So this is, I'm calling those as experience services. And the same could be realized through an API also. So it's very important in today's world. Whatever we expose through any of the engagement tools, we should expose it as an API as well, right? So the same services could be implemented or realized through experience services or APIs, right? In some cases, we might the business might want it only to be exposed on the engagement tools and sometimes only on the APIs, but typically we could implement it in both. So we want to represent both types of services. And finally, the policy objects. These are policies or the rules that are that came into the business architecture, right? It could be some validations or rules within a business process, or it could be a role, right? The definition of a role, so which can be implemented as an access policy, right? So all those business rules related or restrictions, etc. All those can be captured into policy objects, and these policy objects can be reused across all the other components, right? So we'll see how we're going to do it. So we're going to deep dive into each one of them in the next few videos. First, let's look at when we talk about all these four components. How are they mapped to the corresponding business architecture components, right? So as I said, the role and the business process contributes towards the policy objects, right? So the role could be access related policies pretty much, right? So those can be realized as policy objects. Business processes have a lot of rules, right? The workflow that we are defining in the business process, right? So all those are guiding rules, right? So all that can go into the policy objects. And business capabilities or business functions. Some cases we may not be able to abstract business functions into business capabilities, but business capabilities and business functions can be realized through IT capabilities, right? And when it comes to services, so again, business. So there lot of time that we may not be able to abstract a business function into an business function or a business capability into an IT capability, right? They might end up directly mapping to a service, right? So so services are realizing the business capabilities and business function directly or indirectly as an IT capability, right? That's why I kind of have the three arrows coming into the services. It's either realizing a business capability directly or a business function directly or through an abstraction of an IT capability, right? And finally, the business objects, which are realization of the business entities and the business related business functions to that, right? So when we do this exercise of mapping, right? So when we look at once we have the business architecture, all these components defined in business architecture, we need to make sure all the elements, all the instances of those components have a corresponding mapping into the corresponding one of these four information architecture components, right? So this is just to give a brief understanding of how that maps. And right, so we'll look at into once we go through in deep for each of these components, we'll see how that actually, we'll look at some few examples as well. And let's look at some, before we close out today's video, we'll look at the meta model, right? We'll try to define a meta model for information architecture, right? So as we said, there are four components we looked at, right? Policy object, IT capabilities, business objects, and services. So policy objects, so let's look at services, right? So service being a central piece of it, which is what our eventual goal is to deliver those services, right? So services uses the policy objects. So it could be it can use a number of policy objects. It could be rules, access-based rules. It could be validations, whatever maybe the policies are, right? And then IT, and the purpose of service is to realize an IT capability, right? So a same IT capability can be realized by multiple services. That's depends on how these services are being defined and offered, right? So services realizes IT capabilities, and also while realizing the IT capability, it may be using business objects, right? And as we saw, the service can be of two types. It can be an experience service or an API, right? And on the business object side, as I said, business object represents both structural and the behavioral aspect. So business objects have attributes as well as functions, right? Some of the business objects could be strictly behavioral, so it may not have any attribute, or some business object can be strictly structural where it may not have any function, right? So, but most of the time, I would say it will have a combination of both. So in the next video, we will start going in detail into each of these components and give some examples so that we can build onto the concepts, right? To summarize what we covered on today's video, we looked at the key characteristics of the information architecture, the components of the information architecture. We looked at how business architecture components map to information architecture and the meta model. In the next video, we'll start with policy objects and business objects. Thank you.